I didn't really like the church that our family went to growing up. It was a small church, but it had those really high vaulted ceilings and only one window, besides the door itself. In front of the window, and behind the podium, hanging from above the rafters, was one of those really large statues of Christ on a cross. It was actually an agonizing sight, especially when you're just 5 years old. My first real memories of this place were from around that age, so it was back in 1988. And where I grew up in West Virginia, my town was small. And I don't know what it's like now, but in Clearview at the time, this was the main church. There were, of course, others, even in a town with less than 1,000 people. But this was a special church. This was because the preacher claimed to have been touched by God himself. I'll get to that later. But chronologically speaking, the first experience I had was sitting outside the steps of the church, just waiting to go inside while Mama talked with some friends. I was twirling around my Barbie doll, and I glanced over at the church, where just to the right of the entrance I saw a little girl. She was only poking her head and her shoulders out, the rest of her tucked behind the building. I was instantly curious because I didn't know her, and I'd known all of the little girls, I thought. I remember running towards her, my mama calling after me, and the girl dissipated right in front of me. I watched as she went from being there to being nothing. I was now being scooped up by Ma, and we were heading into the church. I was the only one who saw the little girl, I guess, and I would see her again. Sometimes it would be the exact same spot. Sometimes I'd see her sitting in the church, or I'd hear her run away. She never spoke to me, but I felt like she could tell that I could see her. I don't remember seeing her past the 2nd grade, but after that, I started to notice other things. Aside from the larger-than-life Jesus staring down every Sunday, you had the odd happenings surrounding the piano, where it always seemed like it needed to be replaced or repaired in some way. We would be singing, the church would be filled with noise, and then suddenly you'd hear the piano go out, and everyone would stop. I remember this happening all the time, and as I got older, I noticed that this would coincide with things like a light going out, or the sound of someone walking above us. There was no above us, only a vaulted ceiling with a roof atop. No attic, no basement. This was a single-story building, and yet footsteps above. All of the children seemed to notice these steps, and if the adults heard them too, they dismissed them, maybe as birds. And then there was the preacher, the outrageous preacher who said that angels were dancing on the roof. I remember hearing these insane stories at church, and then questioning them when we got into the car, like asking Mama why the preacher was always yelling. I would ask why he had to grab onto people and shake them, get in everyone's face. Why'd he have to do that? She would laugh and laugh, saying he's exactly the kind of man that we need to run that church, to help this town. That he was a man touched by God, and that he was going to bring truth and salvation to our small hillside. He was the answer to our prayers. But what prayers? I didn't feel like we needed anything in our lives. Had we even sinned enough to need to be saved? And every Sunday at that? I didn't press the issue. As an adult, I'm not religious. Not like that. But back then, you just didn't question the church. And you sure as shit didn't question God. So for years, I would attend the church. And through the years, I at least talked with my friends about the preacher, the church, the little girl. Others had seen her too. One girl claiming that her sister, her little sister, could still see her. I had witnesses to what I was seeing, so I knew that it was real. But it didn't hit me until years later what that could mean. The outrageous preacher ended up being a bit of a scam artist. Shocker. I know. He'd taken the church's money and pulled an identical scam a couple of states over, just before hitting West Virginia. Before the days of heavy internet access and cell phones, he'd gotten away with quite a lot. However, he did end up dying in a car accident while driving under the influence. So, as Mama said, he got his. The preacher that replaced this man, he was a good man, like an actual good man, one that took up and moved his family to Clearview. I still didn't care much for church, but at least this guy wasn't yelling at us. It was the year before Mama passed away in 2002 that he gave my friends and I the real story and history behind this church. Years before any of us were born, sometime in the 1950s, this was a 2-story chapel, and there was a young girl who had died there. How? Was the first question that everybody had asked before the preacher could even finish telling the story. He told us that we needed to be prepared for the morbid and tragic truth, at which time we all sort of understood that this was a serious story, and that the excitement we were feeling was maybe misguided. Either way, I needed to hear the rest. When he felt we were listening, he told us that a fire was reported and attended to almost immediately after smoke was seen. But even though they were able to get the fires put out, and only the top floor had been destroyed, they'd made a terrible discovery while putting the fire out. Firefighters had found the partial remains of an unidentified little girl. I remember my friends and I sitting very still, one of them saying, "Wasn't she no one's little girl?" Apparently people had known this story, I just wasn't one of them, I thought. But she was right. The preacher told us that no one came forward to claim the little girl, and no missing children reports ever came through the area. Investigators still don't know much about the little girl, and they never learned what caused the fire or who was responsible for any of it. Basically, it was a tragic mystery for years, and the church remained partially charred until 1975, when it was refurnished into a 1-story, small chapel that I'd grown accustomed to. Never fond of, but familiar with. I don't go back much since Mama passed away, but I do plan to take my kids there sometime. They get a real kick out of this story each time I talk about back in the day. I joked that we gotta wait for a grandkid to show up, since they'll likely be the only ones to see the little girl. Part of me feels happy that people continue to bring their kids to church, even if I wasn't much for it. I like the thought of that little girl having company. If she was stuck here for some reason or by choice, at least she didn't have to be stuck alone.